Fremont County, Wyoming Territory. October 1889. The autumn sun was a liar. It hung low and golden over the Wind River Range, painting the sagebrush in amber and the cottonwoods in fire, and it whispered that the world was gentle, that warmth was a permanent condition of life. But beneath that pretty light the soil had already begun to harden. The frost came at night like a thief stealing the last green from the grass, and anyone who had lived through even one winter in this country knew the truth. October was not a season, it was a countdown. For Madame Dow, it carried the weight of a door slamming shut. She stood in the yard of the small sod house on Kettle Creek, watching two men she had never met drive iron stakes into the frozen mud. They were marking the boundaries of what was no longer hers. The property notice had arrived 6 days after the funeral. Her husband, Peter, a Dane with shoulders like a draft horse and hands that could shape wet clay into anything from a milk jug to a chimney flue, had been killed not by the land but by the animals that crossed it. A bull elk, crazed during rut season, had charged through the fence of the neighbor's stock pen where Peter had been helping mend a gate. The antler had caught him just below the ribs. He bled out on a pile of cedar posts, his fingers still wrapped around a strand of wire. The land office agent, a man named Calvin Pardo, had arrived on the 6th day with a folder of papers and a voice that sounded like it had been scrubbed clean of all feeling. He was not a tall man, but he stood very straight, and he had a way of looking at a point just above your head while he spoke, as though addressing someone more important standing behind you. "The claim was filed in your husband's name, Mrs. Dow," he had said, turning pages without looking at them. "Under the Homestead Act, the improvements revert to the land office upon the death of the filer if no proof of continuous cultivation can be demonstrated by a surviving dependent. You have no children. You are not a citizen." He paused, and for one breath something shifted in his face. His jaw tightened. He looked, for just a moment, not at the space above her head, but directly at her. And what she saw there was not cruelty. It was the exhausted resignation of a man who had delivered this same speech to too many doorways. Then it was gone. He squared the papers on his folder. "I am sorry for your loss. You have until the end of the week." The man with the stakes finished their work and left without speaking to her. The neighbors along Kettle Creek watched from their porches and their windows. The Hadley family, 3 claims to the east, had always been cordial. Mrs. Hadley had brought a pie when Peter died. But now the Hadleys' door stayed shut, and when Maron walked past on the road, the curtain in their front window moved and then went still. Pity, it turned out, had a shelf life shorter than salt pork. It spoiled the moment it became inconvenient. Maron was an outsider twice over, a widow in a territory that measured a woman's worth by the man who vouched for her, and a Dane in a country that still thought of Scandinavians as something between curiosity and nuisance. She spoke English well enough, but her vowels bent in directions that made people repeat their questions slower and louder, as if volume could flatten an accent. She had no family in America. Her father, a master potter in Aarhus, had died the year before she and Peter sailed. Her mother had been gone since Maron was 9. What she had was a box of tools, a bedroll, 3 sacks of barley flour, a small store of dried venison, and a memory that burned inside her chest like a coal that would not go out. Peter had been a potter before he was a homesteader, not the kind who made decorative plates for parlor shelves, but the old kind. The kind who understood fire and earth as materials with their own intelligence. He had learned the trade from his father in Jutland, where they built kilns into hillsides and fired stoneware so dense it rang like a bell when you struck it. On their first winter in Wyoming, when the sod house leaked wind through every seam and the iron stove ate wood faster than Maron could split it, Peter had not cursed the cold. He had knelt beside the back wall where the sod met the bare earth and pressed his palm flat against the ground. "Feel this," he had said. She knelt beside him and placed her hand next to his. The earth was cool but not cold. Not the killing cold of the air outside, which was 20 below and dropping. The ground was a different temperature, entirely. Steady, patient, as then one, alive with its own slow warmth. "The surface is a fool, Merrim," he had said, and his voice was not lecturing. It was reverent. It freezes and thaws and panics with every passing cloud. But 2 feet down, the earth does not care what the sky is doing. 4 feet down, it has forgotten winter exists. The old potters in Jutland, they did not fight the cold. They went below it. He had planned to build properly, the way his father had done. A kiln dug into the hillside, a workshop with walls of rammed earth, a home that used the ground itself as a source of warmth. But there had always been another fence to mend, another acre to break, another season that demanded he be a farmer instead of a potter. The kiln was never built. The knowledge stayed in his head and in the margins of a small notebook he kept in his toolbox, its pages filled with sketches of flue cisterns and clay mixtures and cross-sections of hillside kilns, annotated in Danish with measurements and temperatures. Maren had found the notebook while packing. She had pressed it to her face and breathed in the smell of him, linseed oil and chalk dust and the faint sour tang of wet clay. She did not cry. She had spent her tears in the first 3 days. Now she had something harder in her chest, something with edges. On the morning she was made to leave, Maren loaded what she could onto a small handcart and walked north, away from the creek and the claims and the people who would not look at her. She had no destination. She had only a direction, north, toward the broken foothills where the Wind River Range began its jagged ascent. The land there was unclaimed because it was considered useless. Too rocky for farming, too steep for cattle, too far from water for any sensible settlement. But Maren was no longer operating within the boundaries of what was sensible. She walked for most of the day, the handcart lurching over rocks and sage roots, her shoulders burning, her boots raising small clouds of dust that the wind snatched away. By late afternoon, she had reached a place where the hills folded in on themselves, creating a narrow valley sheltered on 3 sides by ridges of red sandstone. A seasonal creek, barely a trickle this late in the year, wound along the valley floor. The soil here was different. She noticed it because Peter had trained her eye, though she did not realize it at the time. It was not the paly dust of the flatlands. It was dark, reddish, dense. She knelt and scooped a handful and squeezed it. It held its shape. It was clay. Not just any clay, but the heavy-eyed rich clay that Peter's notebook described in 3 separate entries, always underlined, always with exclamation marks. Clay that, when fired properly, became a material so dense it could hold heat for hours. She was kneeling on a battlefield. Not a battlefield of armies, though the Shoshone and the Arapaho had contested this ground for generations, and the cavalry had carved its own scars across the landscape more recently. That a battlefield of geology, where ancient volcanic ash had met glacial runoff and the resulting deposits had been pressed and folded by millennia of tectonic argument into seams of clay so pure a potter would have wept at the sight of them. Maren did not weep. She opened Peter's notebook and began to read. The first week was reconnaissance. She walked the valley from end to end, mapping it in her mind the way Peter had taught her to read land. She found the clay deposits along the creek bank, thick seams of red earth exposed where the water had cut into the hillside. She found a south-facing slope where the sandstone ridge created a natural windbreak, a wall of rock 15 feet high that would block the worst of the winter gales. And at the base of that slope she found what she had been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. A shallow depression in the hillside, perhaps 10 feet wide and 4 feet deep, where some ancient geological event, a collapsed animal den or a pocket of zoophyte that had eroded away, had created a natural alcove. It was not a cave, it was barely a dent. But it was a beginning. She started digging on the 3rd day. The clay soil was dense and heavy, but it yielded to the mattock from Peter's toolbox with a satisfying resistance, peeling away in thick, moist slabs that smelled of iron and rain and something older. something that had never seen sunlight. She dug into the hillside, following the slope downward so that the floor of her shelter dropped below the surface of the surrounding ground. 2 feet down, then 3, then 4. At 4 feet, she pressed her palm against the exposed earth, the way Peter had shown her that first winter. It was cool, steady, untroubled by the October wind that was sharpening its teeth above. She extended the alcove into a chamber roughly 8 feet wide, 10 feet deep, and 6 feet high at the center. The ceiling curved naturally where the clay met a layer of harder sandstone above, creating a vault that felt less like a hole in the ground and more like the inside of a kiln. And that was exactly what she intended it to become. Peter's notebook contained detailed sketches of the Jutland hillside kilns, structures where the potters had discovered that burrowing into the earth created spaces that needed almost no fuel to maintain a livable temperature. The principle was simple but ran contrary to everything the settlers of Fremont County believed about shelter. Conventional wisdom said, build up. Build fake log walls. Build a roof to shed snow. Fight the cold with barriers and burn wood as fast as you can cut it. But the old Jutland potters had learned what the earth already knew. Below the frost line, the ground maintained a temperature around 50 degrees, winter and summer alike. A shelter dug into that constant warmth did not need to fight the cold. It simply stepped beneath it, like ducking under a wave. Murren lined the walls with fired clay. This was the part that made her a potter's wife and not merely a woman digging a hole. She mixed the battlefield clay with creek water and handfuls of dried grass for binding, then packed it against the earthen walls in thick layers, smoothing it with her hands until her palms cracked and bled. She let each layer dry for a day, then applied the next. When the walls were 3 inches thick, she built a small fire inside the chamber, feeding it slowly with sagebrush and dead pine. The heat transformed the clay, driving out the moisture and beginning the slow chemical change that turns soft earth into something approaching ceramic. She was firing her shelter the way Peter would have fired a pot. The process took days. She built the fire a little larger each time, raising the temperature gradually so the clay would not crack. The smoke was a problem at first, filling the chamber until she could not breathe. But Peter's notebook had anticipated this. She carved a narrow flue channel into the ceiling at the back of the chamber, angling it upward through the earth until it emerged on the hillside above, hidden among the sage. The draw was immediate. The smoke rushed upward and out, and the air inside cleared. The flue did something else, something Peter had described with obvious excitement in his notes. The Danish words underlined twice. As the hot air rose through the flue, it pulled fresh air in through the entrance, creating a natural convection current that fed the fire and ventilated the chamber, without any mechanical assistance. She fashioned a door from pine slabs lashed together with strips of rawhide, sealing the gaps with a paste of clay and ash. It was not beautiful, but when she pulled it shut and sat beside her small fire on that first cold evening, the silence that descended was profound. The wind was a memory, the cold was an abstraction. The clay walls, now partially fired to a dull red hardness, radiated the heat from her tiny fire back at her from every direction. She placed her hand against the wall. It was warm. She held it there for a long time. By late October, the structure had taken on a shape that Peter would have recognized. The main chamber was her living space, with a sleeping platform of flat stones raised off the floor and covered with pine boughs, and her bedroll. A smaller side chamber, dug at a right angle, served as cold storage for her food. The temperature differential was remarkable. The main chamber, with even a small fire, stayed between 60 and 65 degrees. The storage chamber, unheated and slightly deeper, held steady at 45, cool enough to preserve meat through the winter. She made her first proper piece of pottery on the 22nd of October. It was not planned as a significant act. She needed a vessel for water, and the clay was there, and her hands remembered what Peter's hands had shown them. She wedged the clay on a flat stone, pushing and folding until the air pockets were gone and the texture was smooth and uniform. She coiled it into a simple jug, pinching and smoothing the coils together until the walls were even. Before she placed it in the fire to harden, she took a thin stick and scratched a word into the wet clay near the base. Pida. The name was not a memorial. It was a signature. Not hers, but his. Everything she was building, every wall she fired, and every flue she carved was his design made real by her hands. She was not honoring his memory. She was completing his work. The piece fired clean and true. The piece fired clean and true. The clay turning the deep red of old brick. When she tapped it with a knuckle, it rang. The first visitor came in November. It was not a friendly visit. Silas Thornton, who ran the general store in the settlement and served as an informal authority on all matters of common sense, had heard from a trapper that smoke was rising from the hills north of Kettle Creek. He rode up on a gray mule with a rifle across his saddle, expecting to find a squatter's camp or worse. What he found was Marin Dahl, her arms streaked with clay to the elbows, carrying a slab of sandstone toward what appeared to be a hole in the ground. He sat on his mule and stared. Mrs. Dahl. Mrs. Dahl. Folks assumed you had gone east. I went north, she said, and continued carrying the stone. He dismounted and walked closer. He could see the entrance now, the pine door, the faint shimmer of heat rising from somewhere behind the sage on the hillside above. He shook his head the way a doctor shakes his head at the patient who refuses treatment. This is no way to winter, Mrs. Dahl. You have dug yourself into the ground like a badger. The spring melt will flood this out. The roof will cave. You will suffocate from your own fire down in that hole. He was not shouting. His voice carried the patient, infuriating certainty of a man who has never been wrong about anything that mattered to him. Come back to the settlement. The church has a fund for situations like yours. He meant charity. He meant pity. Marin set the stone down and straightened. She met his eyes. Her face was thin and weathered, and there was clay drying in the creases of her knuckles. Thank you, Mr. Thorne. I will be fine. He rode back to the settlement and told anyone who would listen that the Danish woman had lost her mind from grief and was living in a hole in the ground. He said it would be a mercy if the first hard freeze took her quickly. He said it without malice, the way a man states that water runs downhill. It was simply a fact of the world as he understood it. December came with its teeth bared. The first true blizzard struck on the 9th, a 3-day siege of wind and snow that buried fences and killed cattle where they stood. The temperature dropped to 30 below, then 35. The settlement on Kettle Creek, built in the conventional way with log walls and shake roofs and iron stoves fed by cords of split pine, began to suffer. The wind found every gap, every poorly chinked seam, every place where two logs did not quite meet. The stoves burned through wood at a terrifying rate, and the woodpiles which had seemed so generous in November began to shrink with visible speed. The Hadley family lost their new cow to the cold on the second night. She froze standing up in her lean-to, her legs locked, her eyes open. 2 children in the settlement developed the deep rattling cough that everyone knew could turn to pneumonia. The second blizzard came on the 14th of December. It was worse. Silas Thornton's store lost a section of roof to the wind, and half his flour stock was ruined by the snow that poured in before he could rig a canvas cover. He stood in his damaged store, surrounded by the smell of wet grain and pine pitch, and thought, with a fury that surprised him, about the Danish woman in her hole. He thought about how right he had been, and how she was certainly dead now, and how it was a waste and a shame, and not his fault. He told himself this 3 times. On the 4th time he put on his heaviest coat and rode north. He did not know why. He told himself he was going to recover the body, or what the animals had left of it. The ride took 2 hours in the deep snow. His mule nearly refused the last quarter mile. When he crested the ridge above the valley, he expected to see nothing. a drift of snow, a collapsed hole, the end of a sad, foolish story. Instead, he saw a thin line of smoke rising from the hillside, steady and vertical in a still air between storms. He saw a cleared path leading from the entrance of the shelter to the creek. He saw a stack of firewood neatly split and arranged under an overhang of sandstone, more organized than his own woodpile had ever been. And he saw Marandar emerge from the entrance carrying a clay jug, steaming. She was not shivering. She looked at him the way a person looks at a neighbor who has come to borrow sugar. Without surprise, without anger, just a quiet acknowledgement that he was there. Silas dismounted. His hands were numb inside his gloves. His face felt like it had been sanded raw. He could feel the cold in his bones in a way that frightened him, a deep cellular knowledge that his body was losing a war. He walked to the entrance and felt the warmth before he reached it. It came from the earth itself, a soft exhalation of heated air that washed over his frozen face like a benediction. He stopped. He stood very still. The warmth was impossible. It was December in Wyoming, and he was standing before a hole in the ground, and the hole was breathing warmth at him. He looked at Maran. She stepped aside. He ducked his head and entered. The interior glowed with the soft light of a small fire burning in a stone-lined hearth at the back of the chamber. The clay walls shimmered with a deep reddish warmth that was not reflected light. It was radiated heat stored in the dense fired clay and released slowly, continuously, like the walls themselves were alive and warm-blooded. The temperature inside was comfortable, not merely survivable. Comfortable. He pulled off his gloves. He placed his bare hand against the wall. It was warm to the touch. He held it there while his fingers thawed, and the sensation returned as 1,000 tiny needles of pain. He looked at the flue channel, the convection current making the fire dance steadily without a bellows. He looked at the clay-sealed door, the stone sleeping platform, the separate cold storage chamber. He looked at the row of fired clay vessels on a shelf carved into the wall, each one sturdy and functional, each one bearing a single word scratched into its base. He could not read Danish, but the word was the same on all of them. Peter. Silas Thornton had built 37 structures in Fremont County. He had framed houses that were considered the finest in the territory. He had measured and plumbed and squared and chinked, and all of it, every nail and every joint, was built on the premise that you kept the cold out. You fought it. You resisted it, like Lef. You burned fuel and stacked logs and sealed gaps, and you held the line against winter like a soldier in a trench. Marin had not fought the cold. She had simply gone where the cold could not reach. Everything he knew was not wrong. Exactly. It was just incomplete the way a man who can see only the surface of a lake does not know about the stillness at the bottom. "Show me," he said. His voice was rough, not with arrogance, with something else entirely. Something that sounded like the first syllable of a word he had never had to use before. Maran showed him. She explained the thermal mass of the clay walls, how they absorbed heat during the fire's burning hours and released it slowly through the night, maintaining a steady temperature the way a stone holds the warmth of the sun long after sunset. She showed him the flue and explained the convection cycle, the elegant, self-sustaining loop of rising heat and drawn fresh air. She explained the constant temperature of the deep earth, the way 4 feet of soil was better insulation than any log wall ever built. She used Peter's words. She used his metaphors. "Give the heat a home," she said, "or it will leave you like a guest who was never made welcome." Silas Thornton returned to Kettle Creek and did something he had never done. He told people he had been wrong. He did not dramatize it. He simply said that the Danish woman had built something he did not understand and that it worked, and that they needed to listen to her. Some laughed. Most did not. The cold had taken the laughter out of them. By the end of January, Marin had 7 students. They came up the valley in small groups, stomping snow from their boots, carrying tools and skepticism in equal measure. She taught them to dig. She taught them to fire clay against earthen walls. She taught them to build flues that breathed. 3 families built earth-sheltered additions onto their existing homes that winter, packing the north-facing walls with rammed earth and clay just as Maren had done. The change was immediate. Their wood consumption dropped by half. The interior temperatures stabilized. The children stopped coughing. By spring, when the snow pulled back from the foothills like a retreating army, the settlement on Kettle Creek had been quietly transformed. Monan did not move back. She stayed in her valley, expanding the shelter, adding a proper workshop where she could throw pottery using the battlefield clay. Travelers on the road north toward the Wind River Reservation would sometimes notice a thin column of smoke rising from an unlikely hillside, and if they followed it, they would find a woman with clay-red hands offering them water from a handmade jug. The jug was always warm to the touch. Years later, the structures Maren built and taught others to build still stood. The technique spread to ranches and homesteads throughout the territory, and geologists from the new state university came to study the clay deposits she had found, calling them among the finest natural ceramic soils in the region. They asked who had first identified them. They were told it was a potter. They assumed it was a man. The notebook survived. It passed through several hands over the decades and eventually came to rest in the archive of a small historical society in Lander, Wyoming. On its final page, in Peter's careful hand, was a sketch of a kiln built into a hillside. Beside it, in different handwriting in a woman's rounder script, was a single line. He drew it. I built it. The distinction matters. Now, let me ask you something, and I mean you, the person listening to this right now. What piece of knowledge are you carrying that the world has told you is useless? What skill passed down from someone you loved has been gathering dust because it does not fit the way things are done? What impossible, foolish, badger-in-a-hole idea have you dismissed because someone with more authority told you it would never work? The blizzard is always coming. That is not pessimism. That is weather. The question is whether you will stand in a cabin built the way everyone else builds cabins, burning through your reserves and hoping the walls hold, or whether you will kneel down, press your hand against the ground, and feel what is already there. The warmth that does not depend on fighting, the shelter that does not depend on winning, the knowledge that someone left you, not in a grand gesture, but in a notebook, in a margin, in a word scratched into clay before the fire made it permanent. Your hillside is waiting. Your clay is under your feet. Start digging. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional, and the events are a dramatization of principles related to survival, pottery, and earth-sheltered construction. The content presented here is for entertainment and inspirational purposes only, and does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or survival advice. Always consult with qualified professionals before undertaking any building or construction-related activities.